Hi, I'm Prism Raven, and these are the color adjustment features of Krita. So in my last tutorial discussing layers, I mentioned that blending modes are quite important in my process, but I didn't think it would be appropriate to discuss them during that video because it's kind of a topic of its own. And that topic that I'm talking about is color adjustment. Now there are many different ways in Krita to adjust your colors, and I won't really be discussing all of them in detail. Instead, I'm just going to be focusing on the ones that I use, my understanding of how they work, and how I use them in my process. First, I'll be going over the different features that Krita has to offer and demonstrating them in an already finished image. Then in the end, I'm going to be showing you how I use these features in the middle of the process in order to redirect the vision of an image, because sometimes the colors that you planned out for an image doesn't really work out and you want to pivot a little bit. And that's honestly the majority of my usage for these features. So yeah, that's a little bit more of a realistic depiction of how I use these color adjustment tools. Let's get into it. The image that you're seeing right now is the final version of the Draw This in Your Style challenge that I participated in. You can see we have different noise filters. We're gonna keep that on. This is the signature and the glow effect that I added on it. And this is the final render of the flattened version of the image. We're gonna turn that off so we can reveal the different layers that make up the image and adjust the colors of those layers. The first feature that we'll be dissecting is the color curves feature. We're going to be doing this on our character render. In order to use the color curves, you just press Ctrl M and this diagonal will appear on your screen. Now, with all of these features, including this color curves, I don't really have a very scientific understanding of how these work. I am very aware that many of them use mathematics in order to adjust their colors, but I'm not really going to get into that. Instead, I'm just going to dwell on how they appear in the image and how I use those changes to my advantage in a painting process. So for the color curves, this top part of the diagonal represents the brightest part of the image, while the bottom part represents the darkest part of it. Bringing parts of it down will darken the image, and bringing parts of it up will brighten it. So if you take this part of the curve and bring it down, it'll darken the image. And when you do the opposite, it'll brighten it. You can choose a channel to adjust. The default one is the RGBA, which controls every bit of color in the image, basically. You can also choose the red channel, which will, of course, affect the red parts of the image. Bringing up the red curve will make everything more red, and bringing it down will turn it into the opposite color, which is cyan. When you choose the green channel, you can shift the colors to be more green or more magenta. And when you choose the blue channel, you can make the image more blue or more yellow. The alpha feature is more unique because it doesn't really affect colors. It more so affects the opacity of the layer. The top part represents the opaque parts of the image or the layer, and the bottom part represents the transparent parts of it. So if you want to bring up the transparent parts and make them more opaque, you just bring up the lower part of this channel and it'll fill it with a black color. And when you bring down the opaque parts of the image, it becomes more transparent. So it's very useful when maybe you painted over the image like this, and in some way, maybe you can't undo it already. You made too many changes after painting on this airbrushed part of it, So what I would do to fix this is I would go to the alpha channel and I would bring down the lower parts of the image, which are already kind of translucent. And as you can see, we are effectively erasing those parts using our alpha channel. And because everything else is more opaque and is represented by this upper part that we are not really moving, like this part that is fully opaque, we are maintaining those opaque parts and reducing the opacity of that airbrushed part over there. So that's really helpful for editing. And yeah, the next channel is our saturation channel. It of course affects the potency or the saturation of our colors. If you bring it down, you make it more gray. If you bring it up, it makes it more colorful. Lightness is kind of similar to RGBA, but it doesn't really affect saturation, I find. When you bring it up, it just brightens the image without really affecting the potency of the colors. Whereas if you do that with RGBA, if you darken it, it makes the saturation more intense. With the lightness channel, when you bring it down, it just makes it darker without really making it more saturated, if that makes sense. The hue channel basically cycles through the different hues, the different colors, without affecting saturation, brightness, and all that. So if you want to adjust the image to maybe look a little more purple, you bring it up. Maybe you want it more pink and red. If you want it to be more cool toned, you bring it down. And yes. So yeah, basically the RGBA is kind of everything combined, I guess, except the alpha feature. It affects the red, green, blue, hue, saturation, and lightness features. That's the basic rundown of how I think when I use curves. So how do I use it practically in an image, How do I adjust colors with it? So let's say maybe you'd want the highlights of this image to be a little more subdued. So maybe you want to turn down these pinky tones of the highlights, So I would basically go to the RGBA channel and I would locate where these highlights are located in this curve. So my guess is that it would be here because it would be a pretty bright part of the image, but it wouldn't be pure white. So it wouldn't be this part right here. So I would bring this down. And of course, it would bring down the other parts of the image as well. So I would isolate that part by putting other points and bringing them back up to where they belong in the diagonal. The more points that you put in this curve, the more easier it is to isolate certain parts of the curve. I think it's actually this part. Yes, the purple parts are this part. If I want to darken them, I would just isolate the point and I would darken this part. As you can see, we darkened the part without affecting the shadows and all that. If you want to brighten it, of course, you want to do the opposite, which is to turn it up a bit. Maybe isolate this more. If you want to make your changes and you're happy with everything, you click OK. This preview feature is also something I use a lot. When it's unchecked, you're seeing the previous unedited version of the layer. And when you tick off that box, then you're seeing the edited version of the image. If you're happy with that, you can click OK. That is basically how curves work. Once you gain an understanding of how it works, it becomes a lot easier to adjust your image because you can control every channel of every layer basically. So yeah, that's really nice. The next feature that I'd like to focus on is color balance. This focuses more on color temperature and the hue of the image, kind of like the curves already, but less dependence on values and more just, like I said, color and hue. If we press Ctrl B, then that brings up the color balance menu. This one is controlled by sliders, so it's more intuitive, I think. And we are again divided into different channels, which is red, green, and blue, with their opposites, cyan, magenta, and yellow. This tab is subdivided into different value ranges, I guess. Shadows, midtones, and highlights. It's kind of intuitive. You just control your shadows and their colors and with this slider feature. By the way, those things, those outlines, it's just a bug caused by this effects feature. I find that it doesn't really affect the exported image. It's just something that appears whenever you do color adjustments. Yeah, I remember why I turned it off now. Going back to the color balance, if I want the shadows to be a little more red, then I'm gonna turn up the red. If I want it to be a little more cyan, I'm gonna do that. Preserve luminosity is to kind of preserve the luminosity of things, Because when you play around with the different channels and you change their values, while you are changing their values, you're making them a little more bright and dark. And preserve luminosity is always just turned on, just so we can preserve the values of the image, basically. But you can turn it on and off, Bump it up, it'll brighten that shadow, and if you turn it down, it'll darken it a lot. So you have your options. Again, I use it kind of similarly to our curves feature, but I just mainly focus this on color. If I want the midtones to be a little more green, I'm doing that. Maybe you would want to preserve luminosity. You can also input the different values. Maybe you'd want a specific look that you want. Maybe you want 4. You can also do some resetting with these features. If maybe you've gone a little overboard and you want to go back to the default. Again, there's a preview feature. You can take a look at things before and after, before you make a decision. You can also access these filters in this filter tab. Just go to adjust and you have basically all that Krita has to offer. I don't use all of these like I mentioned before, but yeah, you have your options. I honestly don't know how they all work. I just know the color balance, color adjustment curves, and levels, which is our next feature that I'll be discussing. Levels is more focused on values, I guess. I honestly don't use this as much. It just controls the levels of everything, the values. When you turn this to this part, then it darkens the darker parts of the image. Turning sliders to the left brightens these parts of the image. The midtones, same with our highlights. Output is for more limiting the value range, I guess. It fades the image, basically. The more you turn them to the middle, then the more they fade. Darkens the highlights and it brightens the shadows. Can sometimes be useful, but I still prefer curves, to be honest. I can still do that with more flexibility with everything that is happening in the middle. So I just use this. Yeah, that is it for our filters. I guess we can now move on to gradient maps. You can access gradient maps again through the filter tab and the map, and just pick gradient map. I'm basically making an adjustment for our background, and you can choose various gradient presets. Krita has many default ones to offer, but I downloaded a bunch of ones. I'll be linking them down below. This gradient essentially assigns a different color to each value of your layer, and when we pick one, like this basic one, it's called amber dreams. The darkest part of the image is essentially black, and somewhere in this mid-tone there are 3 colors that this preset has to offer, which is this orange, this beige, and this lilac, and in the highlight is white. Again, you can turn on and off the preview and click OK if you're happy with the change. And this is kind of one I use pretty randomly. I don't really have like much expectations whenever I go into this gradient map tab. I kind of use it to add sort of chaos to the image, if that makes sense. These don't really make a lot of sense, but they're really cool to look at, you know? Sometimes I just pick at random and I get some of those cool things. If you're not happy with the presets, you can still adjust some of them. Actually, maybe I like this one, but maybe I'd want to change this color. I can just click here and change that color to whatever color I want. Maybe I'd want like a brat green of sorts, like that. And I can also add some new colors. I just click somewhere, whatever I want in this gradient, and I can adjust the color and adjust where it's located. Can do that as many times as I want, I think. Maybe I want a yellow here, like a bright yellow. Yeah, we've created this like really trippy effect. And I honestly don't use this on its own. I tend to use it with our blending modes, which we'll be getting into next. For blending modes, I honestly also just use a pretty random system. Whenever I feel bored with an image, or I feel like an image is a little stagnant and needs a little redirection and I don't know exactly what to do, I make a duplicate of the layer that we want to change. Because, like I mentioned in my previous video, blending modes essentially affect the pixels underneath the layers, at least the blending modes in this. We'll get into this brush blending mode a bit later. We'll just focus on this one. Whenever you add a new layer and you maybe fill it in with this color, the blending mode of this layer will determine how this layer interacts with the pixels underneath it. If I want to use addition, then it will use that. Burn will darken it. Color will affect only the layer's color, not really changing the value much, just changing the hue and the saturation. So I use a combination of these blending modes and gradient maps in order to create variation and changes in my image whenever I feel like I need it. Like I said, I just duplicate it and I go to the filter tab and map and gradient map, and I choose just a random preset, like whatever catches my eye. Maybe I'd want the image to be a little more warm. Oh, that's nice, like an inverted grayscale effect. But you know, maybe I don't want to completely erase the color information that we've had going on in the original, but we want the value structure of what we've built here. That is where blending modes come in. For that, I would typically go in this part of the blending modes feature, the HSX features, the hue, saturation, intensity, lightness, value, and Y. I don't really know what Y means, but for these blending modes, they're kind of the same, but the difference is just the intensity, the lightness. The difference is just how they affect the brightness of the values, you know? They both have colors, saturation, and hue. Maybe I'd want to keep the intensity of those. Yeah. As you can see, we are keeping the intensity of the colors of this layer while still having the bright blues of this layer underneath it. It's a really nice feature. By default, you're gonna have your favorites opened, and there are already a bunch already added in here by default, but you can add to them or erase some parts of it. Maybe you don't want Divide to be added to your favorites. You can just uncheck the box and check the box for whatever you want to favorite, you know? There are a ton of blending modes that Krita has to offer, and it can be a bit confusing, but I can give you a basic rundown of what I think of them. I guess to demonstrate these blending modes, I feel like it'll be better if I use a different gradient map. I'm just gonna pick a different one. I love using this one. It's really subtle and really pretty. For the arithmetic blending modes, I don't really know how to explain them, to be honest, but there's just 5 of them, and this is what they look like. There's addition, which tends to be very brightening. Same with divide. This is inverse subtract, multiply, and subtract. For binary, I call this the crunchy section. Again, I don't know how to explain it, but it looks very crunchy when you add it. It creates a lot of banding and artifacts to your image. which can be cool sometimes when you want a lot of that erratic, random pops of color. But I smooth a lot of these out with some blenders when I'm done with the image, so just so it won't look crunchy. And yeah, a bunch of layers that look very crunchy and creates a lot of artifacting. We are now moving on to the darken section, which is honestly pretty intuitive. It essentially uses the information of this layer that we have here and darkens the layers underneath using those colors. This is burn, darken, and yes, all of that. And I would call these ones the HSX parts. They're essentially very similar things, like they all have color, decrease intensity. The things that are changing is just this like last part of the color system. If you don't know, HS means hue and saturation, and the last part is essentially just intensity, lightness, value, and Y, which is, I don't know what Y means honestly. But yeah, these are quite similar to each other, with just very minor differences, if you notice. Color HSI looks like this, while color HSL looks like this. Just a little darker, I guess. You can do all sorts of different things with this one. You can determine the color. As you can see, we are maintaining the value mapping of this layer whilst having the purpley and desaturated blues of this layer on top of it, you know. You can also decrease the intensity, which darkens it. Decrease saturation, which is intuitively decreasing our saturation. Determining the hue, increasing the intensity, increasing saturation, just intensity, saturation, and yeah. The next section is also another intuitive one. It lightens everything. This is where you get the color dodge and the linear dodges and all that. MISC, I think, is short for miscellaneous. This is also one I use quite often because of these copy channel features here. Yeah, we have all sorts of cool effects. You see why I use these? Like, it creates a lot of randomness that I wouldn't have been able to do with, you know, just painting it on. You have so many different options that can be created in a short span of time. These are the copy channel features, which basically affects only the certain channels that they're naming. And this one is only affecting the blue channels. This one is only copying the green channels, and this one is only copying the red channels, which is why it's, you know, red and the opposite, which is cyan. Mix, I guess it's averaging the pixels of these two in sorts of different ways. I'm seeing geometric mean, so I guess this section is all about creating the averages of these two layers, I guess. Again, another pretty wacky one. Look at that, that's crazy. People always ask me how I get all the crazy colors in my image, and it's honestly this. Combined with, you know, the color balance, the color curves and all that, it's really fun to play around with these filters. Negative is, of course, creating a negative of the image, I guess, which is why we are inverting the colors. Can you see that? It's now becoming more red instead of cyan. And yeah, you can scroll through the different layers, by the way, by being on the brush tool. Just click B if you want a shortcut, and just clicking one and scrolling down using the arrow keys of your keyboard or the up keys, whatever. And yeah, quadratic is a pretty intense section in terms of contrast, I would say. And yeah, I guess now I'll discuss some of my favorites that I use a lot in my paintings. I'll just be doing it on top of everything so you can see how it affects the entire image. Normal, of course, just for normal painting. Multiply, which I use to darken the image, like adding shadows and all that. Just pick a color and it uses that color to darken everything underneath it. Yeah, if you pick a darker color, it creates a darker effect. If you pick white, then it has no effect basically. It's erasing what we've created. Lighten, which only lightens the image. Maybe you'd want to brighten only this part of the image. Maybe you'd want the hair to be a little more gray. You just pick a color, pick that color, and choose a brighter image than that, and paint on top of it. If you paint it on top of this white, like almost white part of the image, it's basically doing nothing, because it only brightens. It's not meant to darken anything. It's only brightening the parts of the image that are darker than this value that we've chosen. Really cool when you want to decrease the contrast of an image. The same principle actually works with darken, which only darkens the image. Maybe you'd want to tone down this like color. You'd pick a color that is darker than that, which is, I guess, maybe this beige here. And you can use that to darken that part only. And it's not really doing much to affect this part of the orange eye. It's just darkening this yellowy part that's really bright. And yeah, maybe I'd also want to do that to the cheeks. Maybe I'd want like something to tone it down a little bit. There we go. See that? That's so cool. It's only darkening the image, as the name implies. Another one that I typically use is linear dodge. I use it to create a very saturated glow. Typically with an airbrush, I just pick a dark saturated tone of whatever color I want, and I use that to create glow. Maybe I'd want a more purpley tone around the book. Really cool. Hue is another one that I use. It just changes the hue. It doesn't affect the value, and it doesn't affect the saturation. Maybe I'd want to change the color of this crystal in here. I want to make it more green. I just pick a brush and change the hue. Really cool. See that? That's so easy. And we didn't have to mess with the values that are underneath it. You know, if we just pick a normal blending mode like this one, and we paint that color, it'll cover everything and delete all those textures that we worked so hard on. We just change it to hue and boom, it suddenly doesn't affect the texture. You can also use divide. Another one is overlay. Overlay, I find, increases contrast. If you use a brighter color, then it increases the contrast and brightens the image. See that? And when you choose a darker color, it darkens the image while also increasing contrast. If you think your image is a little too soft, then maybe you'd want to use overlay. Ooh, I also really like using erase. I guess erase is better used in a layer group. Maybe we just want to affect this book. We Control G to group it, and we create a layer on top of it and set it to erase. Now, everything that we paint on this will erase what is underneath this group. If you pick an opaque brush and pick whatever color, it doesn't matter, and we paint on top of it, it erases that part of the image. Really cool. Maybe a more practical use would be in this like magic shape that we have going on here. Just Control G, create a layer, set it to erase, and we can use this brush to sculpt out this image. Maybe we'd want more sharp, clean shapes, and just use that. And the great thing with using multiple layers and just using the blending modes instead of just erasing is that it is non-destructive. So you can always go back and turn it off whenever you want. Another one that I like to use is saturation. This basically controls the saturation of the image. Like maybe you'd want to lower the saturation of the eyes. Maybe they're a little too potent for you. You just pick a grayish color, and the saturation suddenly matches the grayish color that we picked. Maybe you'd want the opposite and you want a more saturated tone, like in this part of the image. Just brush it on there and suddenly it becomes more saturated. Really cool. And sometimes I even just do a lot of random things whenever I'm bored or I want to pivot an image to a different look. Create a new layer from visible so we can have a flattened version of the image, and add a gradient map, like something. Oh, that's cool. This is why I cut out a lot of parts of my speed paint, because when this is sped up, it looks crazy. It looks like flashing lights, and I don't want to like make it uncomfortable to watch my speed paint. So yeah, maybe I'd want something rainbow. Yeah, like that. And oh, I set the like blending mode to hue, and it suddenly made everything that prismatic vibe without messing with our values and all that. You can also adjust the opacity, of course. So maybe you don't want to fully commit, just a subtle difference. Yeah, that's how I create a lot of those erratic colors that are very random and spontaneous. Really fun. And what I always do when I'm bored is I would cycle through all the blending modes, basically. Just make sure I'm on the brush tool, pick one, and then just use the down arrow to scroll through everything and get to one which I am interested in. Oh, that's cool. The saturation one is cool. So maybe I'd like that, but I don't like those random spots too much. So I would erase some of that just so we can make it look a little less crazy. See how we can transform the image with just some few adjustments, and we have a completely new vibe. This feels a lot more gothic and just a lot more moody and less colorful compared to this one. We can create a new merge of that, new layer visible, and use our different tools like our curves. Maybe we'd want a more dark vibe, more contrast. Maybe lessen the saturation a bit. Perfect. And we can also paint out some of the parts using our brush, which also has its own blending mode. It is by default set to normal, but you can change it to whatever blending mode is available in the Layers tab and change how you interact with the layer that you're working on. So if you just pick normal and pick like beige, then it will just airbrush on a beige color normally. But if I want to maybe change the hue, then we can change the hue without changing the texture and the value, Pick this purple, pink. Maybe we want some overlay so we can intensify that part and brighten it a little bit. Increase the saturation. Yeah, that looks a lot more blended in. It's not perfect, but you get what I'm trying to explain here, We can also do this to this part. We can change the hue. This is more orangey. See that? It looks a lot more natural. Maybe I'd want this part to be a little more pink. We can use hard light and paint on some lip colors. Cool. You can also use some color adjustment like color balance. Maybe I want a more reddish shadow, more yellowy mids, and more bluish highlights. Maybe I don't want to preserve luminosity. Before, after. Maybe I'd want the red to be a more opposite. Before, after. Cool. Yeah, that is basically how I use the different color adjustment features of Krita. Next, we shall move on to how I use it in an actual painting process. How I would realistically use it in the middle of painting. I really wanted a more calm, subdued vibe from this image, but I'm not really liking the way the colors are melding with her skin tone. So I'm gonna use the different color adjustment features to get what I want. I separated the clothing with the background and the skin so we can adjust separately. I'm just gonna duplicate the clothing, turn alpha inheritance on so we can maintain the transparency of that part, and play around with our gradient maps. I'm thinking a lot more pink. Not fully pink, but a bit more pink. That's cool. Ooh, this looks nice. I don't really want to adjust it, so I'm just gonna keep it as is. And I'm gonna do the same random thing for our blending mode. Just cycling through, finding which one I like. See that? I would have never been able to paint that, like, by hand. I mean, I would, but, I wouldn't think of it. It's just nice to add some randomness to your process. Oh, I like the darkened ones. See that? That looks nice. The blue is not too intense and the pinkiness is kind of subdued and sort of matches her skin tone, which is really nice. But now the problem is that the background looks a little off, so I guess I'm gonna do the same thing with the background, duplicating it and using the same gradient map. We actually have Control F to use the same one that was applied previously. Control F and use Gamma Darken. Gamma Dark. I don't know. I'm not seeing it. Maybe hard light looks nice. See that? We were able to go from the before, which is kind of disjointed with the skin tone, to this more pinky vibe that we have going on, which is a lot more harmonious with her coloring. I would just merge this, create a merged version. Same with our background, just duplicate the original and merge the adjustment to the duplicate. So it's just a normal blending mode and I wouldn't have to worry about painting under everything, I guess. I'd make some minor adjustments like using the color curves. Maybe I'd want more contrast with the clothing. Nice. Maybe the skin I'd like to be a little more contrasty as well. Lower the saturation a bit. Okay. And I want the background to be a little more warm. So I pull up the color balance tab, Control B, and I use the midtones because this is kind of a midtone / highlighty part. Just a little bit, very subtle. See that? Before, after, before, after. Maybe a little more green. Yes. That's really nice. So, after I've made all of those changes, I now feel comfortable moving forward with this image and rendering and fixing a lot of the anatomy issues. After some finalizing of the image, this is what the rendered artwork looks like. And yes, I guess the only bad thing that can come out of this is you can maybe focus on it a little too much instead of the actual painting process. As you saw, I mainly demonstrated these tools on already semi-finished parts of an image because of course, these filters will not create the image for you. You are still the one painting everything. They are just for adjusting colors. And the painting process is still much more important, so don't focus on this too much. It can be very time-consuming and pretty wasteful of your efforts and time if you're not using it with the right expectations. It won't fix a bad image, but it can certainly improve on the color aspects of your artwork. So yeah, that wraps it up for this tutorial. This was a long time coming, a lot of people requested it. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you want more tutorials from me. It helps me out a lot with putting out tutorials as well as other non-tutorial art videos that I find interesting. Speaking of non-tutorial art videos, I previously posted a video on illustrating the various urban legends of the Philippines. If you're interested in watching that, you can click here for that video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.